Hey there! So last time I told you that data lake is cheap, that storing data on a data lake is cheap, and that's why you can store massive amounts of data. But actually, what do we pay for in case of data lake? And can we lower the costs based on our usage? So let's find out. Now, let's think about the pricing of data lake. So basically, when it comes to ADLS, so data lake in Azure, so data lake pricing. So basically, we pay for two things or two categories of things. So first of all, we pay for amount of data we store. So let's call it data storage. Basically, how many megabytes of data we store. Obviously, the more we store, the more we pay, right? But secondly, what we pay for is data access, data operations. So let me just call it access. And here I'm thinking about reading data, like reads and writes. There are also some other factors that have impact on our costs. For example, these data redundancy options that we covered last time. But basically, those two things are the major parts: data storage and data access. But let just me write other factors that they are included as well. Now, if we think about the life cycle of our data in a data lake, we could visualize it like this. So let's say that this is our diagram, that on the horizontal axis we've got time, and on the vertical one we've got, let's call it file access. So basically I want to show how the access to our data changes over the time. So let's say that here at this moment T1 we uploaded new file to our data lake. Maybe we ingested some new data, some sales transaction. So that's the time we uploaded the data. Upload file. And most likely at this moment the data usage, amount of reads and writes, it goes up very, very high. But then over time it will probably go down as we no longer access that file that more. Maybe for the first week, if there's some a lot of reporting over this data, this file is accessed very frequently, like every day, multiple times a day. But then over time, maybe we don't have to read this file anymore that often. Maybe during the quarterly reporting, we have to do this, but then not that often. And you should remember that one of the features that we pay for in case of data lake is this access, how many reads and writes we make to our data. And as you can see on this diagram, our usage changes over the time. So it would be great if we could adjust our data lake to this usage just to pay less. And fortunately, there is a feature of a storage account that we could use just to pay no more than we have to. And this feature is called Access Tiers. And let me describe them. So what they are. So basically, we've got 4 access tiers available. And let me just write them. So we've got access tiers, 4 of them. And access tier is set individually per every file, per every blob we store in our data lake. And those access tiers, they differ as they are used for different cases. So what features should we use when comparing those those tiers? So first of all is access speed, which basically means how fast can we get our data stored on a data lake. As you will see that it differs based on the access tier. The second thing we would like to compare are storage costs. So how much we will pay for storing the file using specific access tier. So storage costs. Then we've got access costs. And access costs, it simply means how much we'll pay for reading and writing data from our data lake. And lastly, there is something that I will call retention period, and we'll get back to it soon. Retention period. All right, so these are our features that we would like to compare. Now, the first access tier we have is called hot. And in this case, we can access our data instantly without any delay, like in milliseconds. That's why I drew this lightning. So there's no delay when we have to access our data. However, when it comes to the storage costs, it's the most expensive option. So let me write it like this, those $4 signs, that it is expensive. However, on the other hand, the cost of accessing data that use this hot access tier is the lowest. So let me write it like this, like a single dollar sign. So you can see that data in this hot access tier, they are quite expensive to store, but very cheap to access. And soon I will show you some examples when to use this hot access tier. All right, but what are the other options we have? So apart from the hot tier, we've got cool access tier. And now, in this case, the access speed, so how fast we can get access to our data, is again, it's very fast. Again, it is milliseconds. So we can get access to the data without any delay. When it comes to costs of storing our data, it's lower compared to the hot access tier, but the cost of accessing the data is a little bit higher. So you should see already this balance or trade-off between storage costs and access costs. Now, we've got yet another access tier called cold access tier. In this case, again, we can get access to our data without any delay, so it's very fast, but the storage costs are lower compared to two previous options. Likewise, access costs, they are bigger compared to hot and cool. And finally, what we have is the archive access tier. So let me just write it down using blue, light blue color. Archive. Now, in this case, we cannot access our data instantly because, well, it's archived. So instead of this lightning symbol, I will draw this sad turtle which means that, well, we've got to wait some time just to be able to read our data. And this time, it takes hours, up to 15 hours to get data from archive access tier. So you can see the difference compared to the previous tiers. However, the storage cost is very low. It's the cheapest option to store our data. But the access cost is the highest, like this. So you should already see the pattern when it comes to the cost. So for accessing the data, for storing the data, moving from archive through cold, cool to hot, the cost is getting up. When it comes to access costs, it's the opposite. So if you think about those access tiers, all right, but how to use them? When to use them? So it's like this. Actually, let's move to our diagram, this one, that shows the life cycle of our data. So at the beginning, when we start working with some file, maybe we are in this area, we would like to use hot access tier. Why? Because we are accessing it very frequently. So we want to select the access tier in which the file access is the cheapest, and it is the hot access tier. We will pay more for storing the data, but just because we are accessing the file very frequently, it would give us the biggest cost savings. Then, in time, as the number of file accesses goes down, we would like to change this hot access tier to a cool one, right? Just to limit the costs. Because, well, maybe we are accessing the file once a week, maybe twice a week, but still, we want to make sure that whenever we need to access the file, it will be instantly available. So that's why the cool method would be quite useful here. And number of file accesses is moderate. It's not super high, but it's not super low. So that's why this cool access tier might be still useful. Then in time, as the number of file accesses goes even more down, but we want to still store our data, we could move it to the cold access tier. Again, to save money on costs. And again, we would use this cold access tier whenever we just have to get access to the data instantly, without any delay. For example, we might use this tier for storing some backups, short-term backups. So if something goes bad with our system and we've got to restore it from the backup, then we could use the files stored in our storage account from the cold access tier and have it ready in no time. And because basically we assume that everything will work just fine, and we hope that actually we won't have to use those files, those backups very often, then the number of file accesses is predicted to be very low. So we don't want to pay for it, for those accesses. That's why the cold access tier would be quite useful in this case. And finally, when times go by and we no longer accessing the data, but we've got to keep it for some reason, we might want to move it to the archive access tier. And here, what cases we might use for this tier is like some files that we have to keep for some legal reasons, or some long-term backups that we just need to keep. But please be aware that in case of archive access tier, we will have to wait those up to 15 hours just to get access to this data. So if the system goes down and we need to restore the backup that is stored in the archive access tier, then it won't be instant operation, because we'll have to add this delay just to be able to move this archive tier online. So let me just emphasize it one more time. So hot, cool, and cold access tiers, they are online, which simply means that they are accessible without any delay. On the other hand, the archive is offline, which means that actually we cannot do anything with files in this access tier. First, we've got to move it to one of those online tiers, to cold, cool, or hot. But this operation takes time, up to 15 hours. And only when it is finished, we could read the file. So let me show you in the Azure portal how to set this access tier. So I'm in my data lake. So it is a storage account that has a hierarchical namespace enabled, which converts the regular blob storage into a data lake. And actually, let me upload some file. First, I will create a container, container1. And then inside this container, I will upload a file, just like we did the last time. So I will just drag and drop a file, sample file.txt, and here in the advanced options during the upload, I can specify the access tier. So we've got these hot, cool, cold, or archive options available. And please note that the hot option is marked as inferred, which means that basically that's the default option set at the storage account level. So if I don't specify the access tier explicitly, this default value would be used. But actually, let me choose the cool access tier and let's upload the file. So you can see that the access tier has been set to the cool, and I can get access to the file without any delay. So if I click on the edit button, I should see the content, right? Something very important. So the file is there. Great. Now, let's say that I'm not happy with the access tier we selected and I would like to change it. Maybe I would like to move it to the hot tier, just to save on money. So I could use this change tier button to move it to, let's say, hot tier. And let's do this. And as you can see, the tier has been changed. The file is again accessible without any delay. Something very important. So the contents of the file I can see. Let's move it to yet another tier, to the cold one. And actually this cold tier is the newest one. It was added just recently. Let's do this. So the tier is set to the cold. And we should be able to access the data again without any delay. Let's check it. And yes, we can see that indeed the file is available. So these were those three online tiers: hot, cool, and cold. And basically they differ when it comes to storage cost and access costs. And if you take a look at the data lake storage pricing, you will see that indeed there is a difference in price. So let's take a look at the data storage first. So the first component of our price. And let's focus on those 4 tiers: hot, cool, cold, and archive. And as you can see, the price of storing the data in the hot tier is the most expensive. It's like almost 2 cents, right? And compare it to the archive tier when it's extremely cheap. But that's just one of the parts of the storage account price. Secondly, let's take a look at transactions, at our read and writes. Here is the opposite. So for writing data to files in our hot tier, we'll pay this. But as we go to more offline tier, the price is getting bigger and bigger. So in the archive tier, writing is quite expensive. And compare it with reading. So in case of hot tier, the read is pretty cheap, but for archive tier, you've got to pay over $6 just to read data because of this rehydration option that has to happen, which means that this archive file has to be brought online, and it takes time and it takes money. So you can see that indeed those prices, they vary based on access tier. And basically you don't have to remember those exact values because they depend on multiple factors. What is important to remember that price goes up for the storage costs from archive, cold, cool, and hot, but for access costs it's the opposite. All right, so let's get back to the Azure portal and let's move our file to the archive tier to see what happens. So again, I would change the tier, but this time I will select the archive option and take a look at the tooltip that says that it will make our file, our blob, inaccessible until it's rehydrated back into one of those online tiers, which may take several hours. So let's do this. And now, access tier has been changed to the archive, but if I try to view the content of the file, you will see that, sorry, I can't. Because this file is online, it's archived. And to be able to view it, to work with it, I would have to, again, move it to one of those online tiers, like let's move it to hot. And here when I'm rehydrating the file from the archive tier, actually I have a choice. How fast I want to do this. So using the standard priority, it takes up to 15 hours. Pretty long time. But if I pay more and choose the high priority, it is done faster, but it costs more. But let's just choose the standard mode. And you can see that the status of the file is rehydrate pending to hot. So if I try to open the file, I still can't do this because it's not yet available. It will take hours to rehydrate this file. So even though we moved it to the archive just a minute ago and then we brought it back online, it's not yet available. So that's the issue, or that's the thing we've got to remember about when dealing with files in the archive tier, that it takes time to bring them back online. But sometimes we just need to store our files without any intention to access them. And in those cases, the archive file is the best option. All right, so let's move back to our diagram and let's focus on this retention period. So what is this thing? So basically, each of those access tiers has a retention period defined, which tells for how long Microsoft expects this file to remain in specific tier. And it's set like this. For hot access, there is no period. For cool access tier, we should keep the file in this tier at least for 30 days. Then for cold tier, we should keep it for at least 19 days. And for the archive, it is set to 180 days. Obviously, it doesn't mean that we can't move it to some other tier before that time. We did it previously when we moved the file from archive tier to the hot one. But there is a fine or fee associated with such action. So how does it work? So let's say we've got a file stored in our cool access tier. And we know from the table that it should be kept in this access tier for at least 30 days. 30 days. But if we move it sooner, let's say after 20 days, to, let's say, to a cold tier, it means that, well, we did it too fast, as there were 10 days remaining during which this file should be stored in this cool access tier. So in this case, if we do this, we'll pay a fee for those 10 days that is just called early deletion fee. Early deletion fee. So please be aware that if you decide to keep a file in a specific tier, then it's better to keep it for this period if you don't want to pay additional fees. All right, so let's get back to our portal and let's check where we can see this default access tier that is set at the storage account level. So in the overview tab, you can see that here default access tier is set to hot. So basically every new file that we upload to our data lake will infer this tier. We can change it if we don't like this initial option. So I will modify it from hot to cool. And take a look that we have only those two options available as the default ones. We don't have archive or cold. And if I save it, then every new file uploaded to our data lake will infer this cool access tier. And actually it hasn't been refreshed yet. It is there. It is set to cool. All right, but how to move those files from one tier to another based on the usage? So basically moving every file manually is a bad idea. Again, when we think about usage of our data, maybe we would like to have it like this. So when we upload new file, we would like to store it by default in the hot access tier, because most likely at the beginning of its life cycle, it will be used very often. But then maybe after, let's say, 1 week, we would like to move it to the cool access tier just to pay less. Then maybe after, let's say, 2 months, you would like to move it to the cold access tier. Again, to save costs. Then maybe after 1 year, we would like to move it to the archive tier. And then maybe after 5 years, we would like to delete the file at all. Maybe we no longer need it. Maybe we just had to store some data for legal reasons for 5 years. And now, moving all those files manually, it's a bad idea. Fortunately, Microsoft created this cool thing called Lifecycle Management Policies that can do it automatically. So it is called Lifecycle Management Policy. And it is used to move files through various access tiers in an automatic way. And let me show you how it can be implemented. So again, I'm in the Azure portal in my data lake, and here you should see this lifecycle management option. So let's go there. And let's add a rule based on which our data would be moved through various access tiers. So let me give it a name like rule 1. That will apply to all files in my storage account. We can do some additional filtering, but let's keep it for now. And this is the most important stuff, those rules. So let's say that I want to move a file from one tier to another after, let's say, 7 days. So Azure is smart enough to know when the file was created, and if it was created, in our case, more than 7 days ago, let's just move it to the cool access tier. And it's done. So it will be Azure responsibility to monitor our data, and when the conditions are satisfied, it will perform the action. Likewise, we could define our remaining rules like remove out file. So if it was more than 5 years, let's say 15,000 days since the file was created, then just delete the file. Maybe we no longer need this, and it's done. And now, this lifecycle management policy is pretty cool, but so far we could only set the options based on 2 conditions, like when the file was modified and when it was created. But what if we have a file that is quite often accessed, and that's why we wouldn't like to move it to some lower tier? So how to do this? Fortunately, we have an additional option, this enable access tracking. If we enable it, that costs a little bit extra, then we will have yet another condition we could use. So let's create a rule 2. And here you can see we've got this last accessed property. So this time you can see when was the last time we read this file or updated it. And then based on this time, we could move it to some access tier. So that's a really cool feature, to use those last accessed time properties. All right. So you know that we'll pay for how much data we store and how much accesses, how much operations we'll perform on our data lake. But actually, how to find the proper amount? And there is this cool thing called Azure Pricing Calculator that allows us to estimate the total price of our services that we plan to use. And here, let me just add a storage account to our estimate. And you can see what features or what properties of a storage account have impact on the price. So first of all, we've got to select a region inside which our data lake is located. In my case, it is West Europe. Then we've got to select a type that is chosen for our storage account. And we know that we want to use data lake Gen 2, because for big data, that's what we want to use. We don't care about table storage or queue storage and so on. Data lake is our thing. Then for tier, we've got two options, standard and premium. And basically, premium uses SSD disks under the hood. And in some cases, when we require this super low latency, it might be useful. In our case, let's just stick with the standard. Then for the account type, general purpose V2, that's the only option. And here we've got the options that really impact the price. So the access tier that we just discussed, and the redundancy options, LRS, GRS, and so on. And take a look that our price is split into different categories. So first of all, we pay for capacity, basically meaning how much data we want to store, and we pay for access to our data. And just by playing with these options, you can see how the price changes. So for example, using default values for capacity and transactions, you can see that access price for the data in the hot tier is set to about $30 per month. If we change it to cold, the price went up. The same with different redundancy options. So you can see instantly how those various features you choose, how they impact the price. So that's a very convenient way of playing around with some service before actually creating it. Also, it helps you to focus on properties of a given service that you should read on in the documentation to understand its impact on the price. So I highly recommend this Azure pricing calculator, as it's a great thing. And now, since we already know that we pay basically for every access to our storage account, for every read we make, then it means that actually we should pay attention to our design of a data lake. So we should design it in a way that would minimize the amount of data read by every query we send. And compare it to on-premises, in case of which we didn't have this thing. And let's think about a query that reads all data. In case of on-premises, it would be just slow. In case of Azure, it would be both slow and more expensive. So that's why we should really focus on the design. And I mean by this things like organizing our data lake with proper structure, just to make sure that our queries read only the data they need. It means using proper file types that help us just to select the subset of data we need. And we'll cover that in future episodes. Also think about this data lakehouse approach, in case of which data was stored only in a data lake. So every query would read data from a data lake. So every query will cost money. And now, if you don't pay attention to your design, then it might turn out that actually querying the data is expensive. So you've got to think that upfront. But don't worry, we'll cover that. Alright, so to summarize, you should remember that we've got those various access tiers. And we can choose which one we want to use per every file, per every blob. And basically they differ when it comes to the access speed, so how fast we can get access to the data. And archive option is the offline, which means that we've got to wait up to 15 hours to get access to our data. And those tiers, they differ when it comes to the cost of accessing the data and cost of storing the data. And if you would like to automate the process of moving files between various tiers, we should use lifecycle management policies. All right, and basically that's it for today. Thanks for watching and see you soon. Take care.